One ring to rule them all, one ring to find them, one ring to bring them all, and in the darkness to bind them.
You may have noticed that there has been a bit more time between the last episode, Good vs. Evil, and this conclusion installment than between any other videos in this series. That is because I have been waiting for something to drop that has taken more time than anticipated. I assumed when I started that by the end of this little project, the disclosure I desired and expected would be available to me, but that is not the case, so I have chosen not to wait anymore and to conclude without it. In fact, I now view its absence as serendipitous because it affords me the opportunity to make a prediction and to look like a prophet and a genius when it comes true. Being right all the time is not as easy as I make it look. Of course, there's the slim chance that I will be wrong and look the fool. But given the way things are going in artistic production companies these days, yes, this prediction has to do with another video adaptation of Tolkien's fiction that is presently in the works. I feel pretty confident that the chance is quite slim indeed. But before we get into that, I want to address what I believe is YouTube's heavy shadow banning of my channel. I don't think Susan Wojcicki appreciated being compared to Morgoth in that last Good vs. Evil episode, and ever since that upload, I have seen some pretty clear signs that I have made it onto her shit list, to put it in plain language. I'll try to keep this as clear and concise as possible because it is quite a departure from this video's true purpose, but I think it's worth taking the time and adding it to the growing pile of evidence that YouTube is censoring wrongthink in classic Orwellian social media site fashion. And the videos of this series are being impacted, so it's not entirely irrelevant. Now, I have been accused of paranoia and delusion in the comments section of a recent upload for points I made on a completely unrelated topic, so let me make sure to point out here that I'm not about to present something that will rise to the level of smoking gun proof. I leave it fully to you, the viewer, to decide if I'm onto something or not. Generally speaking, however, the benefit of shadow banning, as opposed to an outright ban, is that it doesn't leave that kind of obvious trail. It only approximates a true ban with the added benefit that it keeps you, the unwitting shadow banned user, strung along and using the site and adding to traffic and ad revenue numbers and such, and being useful to site owners like SusieQ in the ways they really like, but no longer a thorn in their side by spreading all those pesky, dissenting, anti-progressive thoughts to which they'd prefer no one become exposed. Make no mistake, that is the only reason Jack and VJJ from Twitter expressed sympathy for users permanently banned from their own platform on the recent and infamous Joe Rogan podcast with Tim Pool. They desperately want their castrated slaves back. So no smoking gun, but here goes anyway. What I'm about to show you are just a few instances where I witnessed YouTube simply reducing the view counts on my videos. That's right, simply decrementing my stats. Over the past few months, I have seen this happen repeatedly with many different videos, and I wasn't able to screen cap all of it because, believe it or not, I do have a life and can't be signed on all day, every day, hitting the refresh button and making captures. This is me griping in a Gab post about a month ago that over the course of an hour or so one morning, YouTube decided to reduce my view count on the last Good vs. Evil video by 2 views. And here's the same thing more or less happening only a couple days ago, but this time, in only a minute or two, the view count dropped from 45 to 44. I realize images are not the best evidence since they can be doctored, so here are a couple short videos of me switching from an incognito browser session to a logged-in browser session. The first one was captured on the same day a month ago as my Gab post. You can see that several hours later, the incognito session still reflected the higher view count, but my logged-in session showed the reduced one. And the same thing happens in the next video. A higher incognito session number is contrasted with the decremented logged-in session amount. Now you may be wondering why I care about a couple views. Well, these examples are but a small subset of what I personally witnessed happening repeatedly over the course of the past several months. As I said, I can't capture every instance I notice. I mean, I guess I could if I wanted to waste days of my life in the effort. So it stands to reason that unless YouTube reps wait for me to log on in order to rub this obnoxious behavior in, which it seems to me defeats the purpose of a Shadowban, what I see go down with my own eyes must therefore be a subset of the total number of times that it actually occurs. In other words, it must be happening much more often than I can demonstrate or observe. So we're not talking about a couple of views. We're talking about many views lost over a stretch of time. As I often say, I'm a tiny channel, so my view count reflects that. But perhaps you can appreciate that each stat robbed from me works wonders to keep me that way. It's a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy, but frankly speaking, what else would be the point of a Shadowban and messing with my stats like this? YouTube may not exactly be pulling what it deems politically incorrect weeds completely out of the soil, but it's making damn sure it doesn't spray any fertilizer on them and help them spread. The hidden policy, or at least the intent, it seems to me, is to keep any new or small accounts guilty of wrongthink from growing by freezing them out of even the most basic site features and core functionality of the site, such as view counts. Another thing I've noticed is that every time I upload a video, I immediately lose 3 or more subscribers. Now, I really don't care about sub numbers, but it's a little odd since I'm not seeing rage quit level commentary under my videos, and they seem to have a pretty decent like to dislike ratio, at least most of them do. And I will emphasize that immediate part, because it's not like these disappearing subs had a chance to watch what I just uploaded and get disgusted by it. There's much more I could show you, but I imagine this is getting a bit tedious and a little bit like a pity pot fest. The last thing I will point out here is that BitChute probably has about 1/1000th the amount of visitors as a giant site like YouTube. And on top of that, my BitChute account only has 18 subs at the time of this recording. Yet my videos there often get 2 to 3 times the number of views as they do here on YouTube. That could be because all the people who are sick of Suzy Q's BS have jumped ship over to BitChute, and my small handful of brilliant subs here on YouTube are the only ones left on this site who are not intellectually challenged Smosh fans. But the disparity is rather curious and indicative of something more sinister and intentional in my humble opinion. Okay, I'm done whining about my ultimately meaningless YouTube persecution, if I am in fact being persecuted. Suffice to say, there are plenty of alternatives out there now more deserving of my oh-so-radiant and refreshing content, and I'm debating letting this account go derelict. But I haven't made up my mind and won't for a while yet, so let's forget it all for now and get busy with the real point of this video. So after watching all the episodes thus far, you may be wondering, why even do a series defending Tolkien, right? He's basically the most popular author in the universe, and the Tolkien estate and his heirs now have enough money to support who knows how many generations of little Tolkien offspring. The short answer is, of course, since when did popularity stop progressives? In fact, the more popular a franchise, the more they ramp up their insipid attacks. But that's slightly circular reasoning, which avoids providing a more meaningful answer. You see, the real answer, and the ultimate point and purpose of this project, lies in the opening quote from Tolkien about whether or not the stories found in the Silmarillion and the Lord of the Rings belong to him and his estate anymore. The cold hard truth is they do not. A mythology belongs to its originator for a vanishingly short period of time. And if you do not understand why I just said mythology, stop watching immediately and go back to the start of this series. And there's the idea out there that the books are the books, and nothing ignorant on-screen versions do can affect what's on their pages. And while I sympathize with this reasonable-seeming soundbite, when the books are under constant attack for violating politically correct rules, and more brainwashed people are abandoning them, we end up with situations as we have with Tolkien, where his prose becomes increasingly less relevant than its various interpretations. interpretations. In only a few generations, a mythology's characters, plotlines, and themes can begin to be shaped by the society for which it was crafted in the first place. And as that society changes, so do the lessons of the mythology. I've brought up Terry Brooks's Shannara books at least twice so far in the series, I believe, and there's a good reason why I've done this. As a lesser effort to Tolkien's own epic fantasy fiction, and something that falls short of the mythology label, and therefore can be thought of more readily as simple escapism, they have proven more susceptible to the phenomenon I just mentioned, being shaped and molded by subsequent generations. Simple fantasy is not quite as resilient as more profound mythology. Now, perhaps you see where I'm headed with this, and maybe you're feeling the urge to protest that, of course, a teeny bopper MTV version of a fantasy story is going to be plagued with virtue-signaling tributes to diversity and progressivism, but this is just one example. There seems to be no end to the odd need producers like Netflix and Hollywood in general seem to have to put Asians and black people in all sorts of out-of-place and anachronistic fantasy roles. And look, this complaint of mine, if you want to call it that, is not to be confused with perfectly logical black characters in fantasy fiction. For instance, Zorro and Salladhor Saan in Game of Thrones are totally believable if you ask me, because they are not black elves. They are mere men from exotic, non-European seeming locales who have decided to travel and or do business with their universe's version of white people. There is nothing forced or pretentious about their believable roles. Black and Asian elves, on the other hand, are completely asinine. Elves are mythical European beings, not African or Asian beings, or at least the type of elves found in The Lord of the Rings, and the Elfstones of Shannara are, anyway. There are probably mythical analogues from other places which are quite different from the noble beings found in Tolkien's fiction. And it's not at all racist to insist that these elves have white skin. In the same way that there's nothing racist about insisting only one Viking be found frolicking around Wakanda, rather than a curiously large amount of them. All well and good, you may be saying to yourself, but what does this have to do with mythologies being crafted by subsequent generations and the Silmarillion and the Lord of the Rings? Even the Lord of the Rings films, you may want to point out, did not have black or Asian elves. You're right, of course, but your statement is lacking one rather critical word: yet. And Peter Jackson's versions of the stories are all the proof I need that we are in fact heading down the treacherous path of Lord of the Rings adaptations where Gandalf is an Asian wizard and Aragorn or Legolas is black. How can I say something so crazy? Well, have you forgotten Arwen Warrior Princess already? And now is the time for all the Peter Jackson fans to rage quit this video and hit the dislike button like mad. Fine, I don't care, do what you gotta do. But if you're still with me, here's the truth of the matter. The feminist character of Arwen, as played by Liv Tyler in the movies, is a clear indication of subsequent generations crafting Tolkien's mythology based on the progressive political indoctrination they have been subjected to. The scene at the Fort of Bruinen is without question the most important scene in the books. This is why it is the very first passage from the stories that I chose to reference in this series, after the introductory episode, that is. Why is it so important? Because until that very moment, we as readers have no idea Frodo, the main character, has what it takes to challenge Mordor and its minions. In fact, if you're reading the books for the first time, you have every reason to suspect that Frodo is simply another soft, pudgy, hapless hobbit who is about to readily forfeit the ring and eagerly bow out of the coming difficulties. And there he is, summoning his last bit of failing strength to defy the Black Riders. So maybe Gandalf is right, and he is indeed made of tougher stuff than most give hobbits credit for. Maybe he can be the ring bearer for the remainder of the tale and do whatever needs to be done. That's the impression most readers of the books get of Frodo's character. In the films, however, he's a useless sack of potatoes carried by the feminist wunderkin that is Arwen. Here she is fending off the Black Riders, sword drawn, and summoning the floodwaters of the Bruinen herself. Hopefully you remember from the Hierarchy and Equality episode that I went to great lengths as a young man figuring out how it was that Elrond was able to wash the ring wraiths right out of Rivendell. Well, Peter Jackson would like you to believe Arwen wears Vilya, the greatest of the three elven rings. rings. What else are we supposed to deduce from what we're watching here? I watched this scene in the cinema when these movies came out, completely perplexed. Why the hell would the Council of Elrond agree to put the ring in Frodo's care? I mean, shit, Arwen seems a better choice in the story the movies tell. Boromir's argument starts to make sense if you ask me. It is unhappy chance that gave it to a pathetic failure like the film version of Frodo. The most important scene in the entire trilogy, and fat-ass PJ foists some Mary Sue on us. But people are running for my video's dislike button and mindlessly throwing their hard-earned cash at PJ. And I was one of those fools. I actually went on to pay for and watch The Two Towers and The Return of the King as well. But this Ford scene really sealed the deal with me and Peter Jackson. I have not watched and will not watch the Hobbit movies or anything else he does in Middle-earth, including, and perhaps especially, any adaptation of the stories in the Silmarillion. They are much too important for his inadequate horror film instincts. Now, I have nothing against a mindless gory romp if that's what people are into, and we can argue until we're blue in the face if its director has or had what it takes to put The Lord of the Rings to film. But he will no doubt lack the tact and restraint required to pull off a highbrow Silmarillion production. We don't need the Valar getting spitted onto exquisitely sharpened and suspiciously located spiked wheels, the logical or mechanical purpose of which may remain forever beyond any thoughtful person's comprehension. I'm aware this opinion of mine comes across as incredibly elitist. A close friend once described what I'm looking for in Lord of the Rings movies as my dinner with Frodo. But trust me, when it comes to big or small screen versions of the stories in the Silmarillion anyway, we want 2001: A Space Odyssey, not Battle Beyond the Stars. We want patience and skill, and a filmmaker who recognizes, like Tolkien did, that less is more. Peter Jackson has proven beyond a shadow of a doubt that he is simply not that person. As I hinted at in the beginning of this video, another equally, if not more troubling production team than Peter Jackson and New Line Cinema seems to have in fact acquired rights to a Silmarillion story, and I will address this shortly. My criticism and consumerism, or lack thereof, of Peter Jackson's movies is all well and good, or maybe more than a little irritating if you're a fan, but the more pressing issue is that this version with Arwen Warrior Princess is the beginning of the end when it comes to the subject of the sensibilities of subsequent generations altering Tolkien's mythology in what I see as a negative way. And here's a sample of the thanks Peter Jackson got from progressives, who make a snob like me look like a bootlicking fanboy, for injecting the most important scene in the story with a fatal dose of feminism. Where are the women? Peter Jackson filled out Liv Tyler's role for the movies. It's much less prominent in Tolkien's version, but the Fellowship is still as much a boys' club as Augusta National. Lev Grossman, Time Magazine. Congrats, PJ. Did you really expect to be praised by these lunatics? This is why I need filthy casuals like Sargon and Black Pigeon Speaks and all other normie moviegoers to stop filleting Peter Jackson and actually pick up the books and think while they do so. This is why this series needed to be made. This is why, yes, Tolkien's original vision still does in fact need defending, because people have given up on thinking and have farmed out all of their cognitive duties to others, and progressives are more than happy to be the ones doing that thinking for them. The more we let liberal Hollywood jackasses like Peter Jackson shape the versions of the stories we experience, the farther we drift from the true meaning and intent of the original tales, and the closer we get to Native American Rohirrim and Arabic hobbits. Those of you familiar with the professor's opinion of cinematic translations of his fiction know that he was not a big fan of the idea, and with good reason it would seem. His tales simply do not conform to the Hollywood 2-hour film format, shallow plot formulae, and cliched story arcs, and the need to turn a profit by not challenging average filmgoers too greatly and chasing them away from the theater. Like hobbits only enjoy reading books that contain information they already know, the general public likes to watch the same film over and over again, maybe with a few wardrobe or character changes here and there. In a sense, Peter Jackson had no choice but to turn Arwen into a warrior princess, and to amplify her relationship with Aragorn into a predictable, gooey Hollywood love story. This is the crap movie audiences like to see over and over and over again. Tolkien knew instinctively that this would be the final result of any film adaptation without ever having seen it firsthand. He passed away well before The Lord of the Rings made it to the big screen. But one has to wonder, were he still alive today, and he would of course be 127 years old and challenging the old Took and Bilbo, but if he were still alive, would he recognize the progressive influence in new versions of his mythology? Amazon Prime appears to be producing a series about the rise and fall of Numenor. Now, I have to admit that the only screen adaptation of Tolkien's fiction that I ever yearned for in the slightest is the Silmarillion. I've always envisioned it as an animated series covering the entirety of the book, but if the Akalabeth is all I can get, I'll take it. In artful hands, it does have the potential to make a truly spectacular series. But I'm afraid artful hands are hard to come by these days. Progressive rot taking over any production, be it video game or film production, is the rule anymore, even with the versions that start off rather promisingly. Take HBO's Game of Thrones as an example once again. The first few seasons were some of the finest on-screen epic fantasy you will ever find, staying honest to the shocking apolitical brutality of the books, with characters, both male and female, suffering tremendously and dropping dead left and right. However, where it was once the case in the first few seasons that everyone was going to die, now it's the case that no one is going to die. Jon Snow comes back from the dead, the Hound rises again, Jorah Mormont gets cured of his terminal disease, and so on. Everyone, it turns out, is now the Lightning Lord, Beric Dondarrion, with 7 or more lives. And it seems as though writers have caved to real-life feminist complaints and pressure after the public outrage caused by scenes like Ramsay and Sansa's wedding night. What else can explain the sheer number of female rulers we now have, other than an attempt to appease the feminist hordes? Dany, Cersei, the Sand Snakes, Sansa, Little Lady Mormont, and on and on and on. It is patently absurd to have so many women seated on thrones in a medieval setting, and I half expect the sinister blue guy north of the Wall to transition in the final season to continue the trend. So given the implications of Arwen Warrior Princess and the progressive rot taking over most productions these days, I don't hold out much hope for this Amazon show. If I had to guess, our Pharazôn and crew will be depicted as arrogant dude bro Nazis, essentially, especially after Sauron is cowed, captured, and brought to the island. And the faithful will be the multicultural-loving progressive heroes who prevent oppression and persecution of completely out-of-place minorities in Numenor. Black or brown or yellow people who either came voluntarily from regions like Harad or Rhûn or the other Hitherlands to be the Salador Sands of the series, or were taken as slaves by Pharazôn's evil imperial minions. The problem with this is that the racial homogeneity of Numenor would have been not only greater than a real-world island nation analog like Japan, but in fact total. The inhabitants would be 100% Dunedain. They were a race of men with elven blood in their veins and separate from all other men. Numenor was given to them and to them alone, and they dwelt under the protection of the Valar, unlike the lesser races of men in Middle-earth, and in many ways they grew even more distant from other kindred of men as time went on, and they developed greater in stature both mentally and physically. You will hopefully recall the racial hierarchies mentioned in the second episode. Well, Numenor would have intensified such racial stratification, among men anyway. Salador Saan, while an interesting character in an understandably multicultural Westeros in the Game of Thrones universe, would have no place in Numenor. He, or any character like him, likely would not even desire to live there. As the Dunedain would wither like moths before a great flame in Valinor, so would the lesser races of men in Numenor, if in less rapid and dramatic fashion. It's entirely possible that I'm right about a diverse cast, but wrong about the other races of men besides the Dunedain dwelling in Numenor. Perhaps diversity in Westerness will not be depicted at all. What we may see is harsh treatment back in Middle-earth at the hands of domineering and imperialist Numenorean leaders, causing the people of Khand and Harad and Rhûn to side with Sauron. This cruelty may be part of a larger pattern of behavior intended to spite the Valar for not allowing the Dunedain into the Undying Lands. The idea, of course, being that the Haradrim and other races didn't do nothing, as the online saying goes, and it's all the fault of the evil white Numenoreans giving them no other choice but to run into the clutches of the Dark Lord. I expected the release of telling information from Amazon Prime by now, such as a cast list which would confirm or deny these suspicions of mine, but none is forthcoming. Amazon is being quite tight-lipped, and sorry, but this is not reassuring. The less they tell us, the more worrying and preposterously riddled with modern politics I suspect the final product will be. Trust me, there's a reason why Khand and Herod are prominently marked on the only hint we have been given so far, the maps the series will be utilizing. That's my prediction anyway, that Numenor, most unfortunately, is about to get woke. We'll see how prophetic it turns out to be. As heretical as this may sound, Tolkien himself might have encouraged this progressive adulteration of his works by pandering to feminists and beginning to rework Galadriel's role, as mentioned in the introduction to this series. But would he see an Asian Gandalf coming before the version of The Lord of the Rings with such in it were foisted upon us? What would he make of Arwen, the feminist Mary Sue, and a multicultural Numenor, as I'm predicting we'll see in this Amazon production? And would he feel free to speak out against it? It's entirely possible as an academic, especially as a professor of the ever-paused humanities, Tolkien would cave to the pressure and seek acceptance from the progressive cathedral like so many intellectuals these days. White men, especially old white men, are simply not allowed to speak their minds anymore in academia and retain their standing and positions. And as this series hopefully has made plain, so much of Tolkien's fiction is at thematic odds with the modern progressive agenda, which has metastasized throughout our educational system and universities. Hopefully without sounding too much like one of the pretentious hipsters mentioned in previous episodes, there isn't much I read, watch, or experience that could be considered mainstream. The literature, music, and films I enjoy, and even the video games I play, are all pretty obscure. Any subs who have watched my Wizardry series can testify to the music and video game bit, at least. And being MGTOW, my lifestyle is anything but what most people would consider normal. Tolkien's writing is one of the few mainstream, normie things I choose to keep as part of my life and revisit from time to time. I don't know if the Silmarillion and the Lord of the Rings rise to the level of fine literature, and for the purposes of this series, I don't know that I care, so I leave that for others to decide. For me, his tales are like the brandy of literature, smooth and sweet, and go down much easier than most other choices. Take that as you will. A more important issue, as I see it, is what Tolkien and his influential mythology represent for our society at this critical juncture in its history, when so many progressive political goals are being forced down our throats. Celebrity and fame don't mean much to me, and there are very few famous people I'd care to meet, but given a functioning time machine, Tolkien is definitely one of them. And I think he's the only person beyond friends and family with whom things might get a little emotional during a meeting. Well, for me anyway. The professor would probably just see me as another crazy American. But I can't help but think of him as the fatherly or grandfatherly figure whose wisdom we in the Western world ignore at our own peril. And the lessons he offers us are not just being ignored, they are being vilified. So much about the fragile civilization people of European descent have built is not just being taken for granted presently, but openly attacked. The political left is consumed with the idea that our hierarchical institutions, our dedication to our own people, our traditions and languages, and our notions of good and evil can be ignored and discarded, and our doors can be flung wide open to allow in the entirety of the rest of the world and whatever priorities it holds dear. The lunacy of running this quixotic experiment is now becoming obvious even to outsiders. Imagine the outrage if a Western leader summed up the present political situation in such simple terms. How far has our degradation advanced if we are not allowed to express in our own words, using our own language, what is happening to our civilization? It should be the greatest shock to our system to realize that only outsiders can describe what is happening to us, and we are not permitted to do so ourselves. And the very words we would use are being taken from us and rendered meaningless. The warnings are all there in Tolkien's fiction for those who are willing to recognize and accept them. And ultimately, that's one of the major points of this project. I ask that the next time you revisit the Tales of Middle-earth, you keep the points I raised in mind and see if they resonate with you and give you new perspective on the professor's works. As always, you have my sincere gratitude for taking an interest in and the time to watch these videos, which turned out to be a little more revealing and self-indulgent than even I had envisioned at the outset. Tolkien, it would seem, is a personal, lifelong matter for me. Your understanding and appreciation means a lot. And I hope all of you stay tuned for the addendum installment, Hidden MGTOW Kernels, but I understand that the topic does not appeal to everyone. Thanks so much for tuning in once again. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you around the old channel, provided YouTube doesn't run it into the ground.